This podcast is brought to you by Tor Books. Read The Living Dead by George A. Romero and Daniel Kraus, on sale now wherever books are sold. When George Romero passed away in 2017, New York Times bestselling author Daniel Kraus finished the father of zombie horror's final zombie work. Set in the present day, The Living Dead is an entirely new tale, the story of the zombie plague as George A. Romero wanted to tell it. Joe Hill calls The Living Dead a horror landmark and a work of gory genius.
That is not dead which can eternal lie, and with strange eons a podcast shall rise. H.P. Lovecraft, Weird Tales, Ramsey Campbell, Cthulhu, Laird Barron, Silent Hill, Brian Lumley, Dagon. There's something sinister out there in the cosmos, and the tendrils run deep.
Hi, folks.
Throughout
Welcome to
the
Cosmic
universe.
Shenanigans. This is
Only
Mary
one
SanGiovanni.
woman dares to
And
traverse
as always,
the web.
I'm up to Shenanigans.
Mary
Cosmic
SanGiovanni,
proportions.
who once
This
again
week
is
we are
up
doing
to
our part 2
Cosmic
in
Shenanigans.
the study of Randolph Carter as a autobiographical character of Lovecraft's who manages to survive and continue to have these occult experiences despite the fact that he comes pretty closely in contact with and is often injured by the unnameable things in Lovecraft's world. This story, aptly called The Unnamable, I think is perhaps Lovecraft's way of explaining his writing style, maybe. Maybe it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek in terms of that. But it also, I think, suggests a certain cosmic horror worldview about the creatures that we're dealing with and why he chooses to portray them the way that he does. So we'll have a reading of this and then a little discussion afterwards. The Unnamable. We were sitting on a dilapidated 17th century tomb in the late afternoon of an autumn day at the old burying ground in Arkham, and speculating about the unnamable. Looking toward the giant willow in the center of the cemetery, whose trunk has nearly engulfed an ancient, illegible slab, I had made a fantastic remark about the spectral and unmentionable nourishment which the colossal roots must be sucking in from that hoary charnel earth. When my friend chided me for such nonsense and told me that since no interments had occurred there for over a century, nothing could possibly exist to nourish the tree in other than an ordinary manner. Besides, he added, my constant talk about unnamable and unmentionable things was a very puerile device, quite in keeping with my lowly standing as an author. I was too fond of ending my stories with sights or sounds which paralyzed my hero's faculties and left them without courage, words, or associations to tell what they had experienced. We know things, he said, only through our 5 senses and our religious intuitions. Wherefore, it is quite impossible to refer to any object or spectacle which cannot be clearly depicted by the solid definitions of fact or the correct doctrines of theology, preferably those of the Congregationalists, with whatever modifications tradition and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle might supply. With this friend, Joel Manton, I had often languidly disputed. He was principal of the East High School, born and bred in Boston, and sharing New England's self-satisfied deafness to the delicate overtones of life. It was his view that only our normal objective experiences possess any aesthetic significance, and that it is the province of the artist not so much to rouse strong emotion by action, ecstasy, and astonishment, as to maintain a placid interest and appreciation by accurate, detailed transcripts of everyday affairs. Especially did he object to my preoccupation with the mystical and the unexplained, for although believing in the supernatural much more fully than I, he would not admit that it is sufficiently commonplace for literary treatment. that a mind can find its greatest pleasure in escapes from the daily treadmill and in original and dramatic recombinations of images, usually thrown by habit and fatigue into the hackneyed patterns of actual existence, was something virtually incredible to his clear, practical, and logical intellect. With him, all things and feelings had fixed dimensions, properties, causes, and effects. And although he vaguely knew that the mind sometimes holds visions and sensations of far less geometrical, classifiable, and workable nature, he believed himself justified in drawing an arbitrary line and ruling out of court all that cannot be experienced and understood by the average citizen. Besides, he was almost sure that nothing can be really unnameable. It didn't sound sensible to him. Though I well realized the futility of imaginative and metaphysical arguments against the complacency of an orthodox sun-dweller, something in the scene of this afternoon colloquy moved me to more than usual conscientiousness. The crumbling slate slabs, the patriarchal trees, and the century gambrel roofs of the witch-haunted old town that stretched around all combined to rouse my spirit in defense of my work, and I was soon carrying my thrusts into the enemy's own country. It was not, indeed, difficult to begin a counterattack, for I knew that Joel Manton actually half clung to many old wives' superstitions, which sophisticated people had long outgrown, beliefs in the appearance of dying persons at distant places, and the impressions left by old faces on the windows through which they had gazed all their lives. To credit these whisperings of rural grandmothers, I now insisted, argued a faith in the existence of spectral substances on the earth, apart from and subsequent to their material counterparts. It argued a capability of believing in phenomena beyond all normal notions. For if a dead man can transmit his visible or tangible image half across the world or down the stretch of the centuries, how can it be absurd to suppose that deserted houses are full of queer sentient things, or that old graveyards teem with the terrible, unbodied intelligence of generations? And since spirit, in order to cause all the manifestations attributed to it, cannot be limited by any of the laws of matter, why is it extravagant to imagine psychically living dead things in shapes, or absence of shapes, which must for human spectators be utterly and appallingly unnameable? Common sense, in reflecting on these subjects, I assured my friend with some warmth, is merely a stupid absence of imagination and mental flexibility. Twilight had now approached, but neither of us felt any wish to cease speaking. Manton seemed unimpressed by my arguments and eager to refute them, having that confidence in his own opinions which had doubtless caused his success as a teacher, whilst I was too sure of my ground to fear defeat. The dusk fell, and lights faintly gleamed in some of the distant windows, but we did not move. Our seat on the tomb was very comfortable, and I knew that my prosaic friend would not mind the cavernous rift in the ancient, root-disturbed brickwork close behind us, or that the utter blackness of the spot brought by the intervention of a tottering, deserted 17th century house between us and the nearest lighted road. There in the dark, upon that riven tomb by the deserted house, we talked on about the unnamable, and after my friend had finished his scoffing, I told him of the awful evidence behind the story at which he had scoffed the most. My tale had been called The Attic Window and appeared in the January 1922 issue of Whispers. In a good many places, especially the South and the Pacific Coast, they took the magazines off the stands at the complaints of silly milksops, but New England didn't get the thrill and merely shrugged its shoulders at my extravagance. The thing, it was averred, was biologically impossible to start with, merely another of those crazy country mutterings which Cotton Mather had been gullible enough to dump into his chaotic Magnalia Christi Americana, and so poorly authenticated that even he had not ventured to name the locality where the horror occurred. And as to the way I amplified the bare jotting of the old mystic, that was quite impossible, and characteristic of a flighty and notional scribbler. Mather had indeed told of the thing as being born, but nobody but a cheap sensationalist would think of having it grow up, look into people's windows at night and be hidden in the attic of a house in flesh and in spirit till someone saw it at the window centuries later and couldn't describe what it was that turned his hair gray. All of this was flagrant trashiness, and my friend Manton was not slow to insist on that fact. Then I told him what I had found in an old diary, kept between 1706 and 1723, unearthed among family papers not a mile from where we were sitting, that and the certain reality of the scars on my ancestor's chest and back, which the diary described. I told him, too, of the fears of others in that region, and how they were whispered down for generations, and how no mythical madness came to the boy who in 1793 entered an abandoned house to examine certain traces suspected to be there. It had been an eldritch thing. No wonder sensitive students shudder at the Puritan age in Massachusetts. So little is known of what went on beneath the surface. So little, yet such a ghastly festering as it bubbles up putrescently in occasional ghoulish glimpses. The witchcraft terror is a horrible ray of light on what was stewing in men's crushed brains, but even that is a trifle. There was no beauty, no freedom. We can see that from the architectural and household remains and the poisonous sermons of the cramped divines. And indeed, that rusted iron straitjacket lurked gibbering hideousness, perversion, and diabolism. Here truly was the apotheosis of the Unnamable. Cotton Mather, in that demonic sixth book, which no one should read after dark, minced no words as he flung forth his anathema. Stern as a prophet, and laconically unamazed as none since his day could be, he told of the beast that had brought forth what was more than beast, but less than man, the thing with the blemished eye, and of the screaming drunken wretch that they hanged for having such an eye. This much he badly told, yet without a hint of what came after. Perhaps he did not know, or perhaps he knew and did not dare to tell. Others knew, but did not dare to tell. There was no public hint of why they whispered about the lock on the door to the attic stairs in the house of a childless, broken, embittered old man who had put up a blank slate slab by an avoided grave, although one may trace enough evasive legends to curdle the thinnest blood. It is all in that ancestral diary I found, all the hushed innuendos and furtive tales of things with a blemished eye seen at windows in the night or in deserted meadows near the woods. Something had caught my ancestor on a dark valley road, leaving him with marks of horns on his chest and of ape-like claws on his back. And when they looked for prints in the trampled dust, they found the mixed marks of split hooves and vaguely anthropoid paws. Once a postwriter said he saw an old man chasing and calling to a frightful, loping, nameless thing on Meadow Hill, and in the thinly moonlit hours before dawn, and many believed him. Certainly there was a strange talk one night in 1710 when the childless, broken old man was buried in the crypt behind his own house, in sight of the blank slate slab. They never unlocked that attic door, but left the whole house as it was, dreaded and deserted. When noises came from it, they whispered and shivered and hoped that the lock on the attic door was strong. Then they stopped hoping when the horror occurred at the parsonage, leaving not a soul alive or in one piece. With the years, the legends take on a spectral character. I suppose the thing, if it was a living thing, must have died. The memory had lingered hideously, all the more hideous because it was so secret. During this narration, my friend Manton had become very silent, and I saw that my words had impressed him. He did not laugh as I paused, but asked quite seriously about the boy who went mad in 1793, and who had presumably been the hero of my fiction. I told him why the boy had gone to that shunned, deserted house, and remarked that he ought to be interested since he believed that windows retained latent images of those who had sat at them. The boy had gone to look at the windows of that horrible attic because of tales of things seen behind them, and had come back screaming maniacally. Manton remained thoughtful as I said this, but gradually reverted to his analytical mood. He granted for the sake of argument that some unnatural monster had really existed, but reminded me that even the most morbid perversion of nature need not be unnamable or scientifically indescribable. I admired his clearness and persistence and added some further revelations I had collected among the old people. Those later spectral legends, I made plain, related to monstrous apparitions more frightful than anything organic could be, apparitions of gigantic bestial forms, sometimes visible and sometimes only tangible, which floated about on moonless nights and haunted the old house, the crypt behind it, and the grave where a sapling had sprouted beside an illegible slab. Whether or not such apparitions had ever gored or smothered people to death, as told in uncorroborated traditions, they had produced a strong and consistent impression, and were yet darkly feared by very aged natives, though largely forgotten by the last 2 generations, perhaps dying for lack of being thought about. Moreover, so far as aesthetic theory was involved, if the psychic emanations of human creatures be grotesque distortions, what coherent representation could express or portray so gibbous and infamous and nebulosity as the specter of a malign, chaotic perversion, itself a morbid blasphemy against nature? Molded by the dead brain of a hybrid nightmare, would not such a vaporous terror constitute in all loathsome truth the exquisitely, the shriekingly unnameable? The hour must now have grown very late. A singularly noiseless bat brushed by me, and I believe it touched Manton also, for although I could not see him, I felt him raise his arms. Presently he spoke. "But is that house with the attic window still standing and deserted?" "Yes," I answered, "I have seen it." "And did you find anything there in the attic or anywhere else?" "There were some bones up under the eaves. They may have been what that boy saw. If he was sensitive, he wouldn't have needed anything in the window glass to unhinge him. If they all came from the same object, it must have been an hysterical, delirious monstrosity. It would have been blasphemous to leave such bones in the world, so I went back with a sack and took them to the tomb behind the house. There was an opening where I could dump them in. Don't think I was a fool. You ought to have seen that skull. It had 4-inch horns, but a face and jaw something like yours and mine." At last I could feel a real shiver run through Manton, who had moved very near. But his curiosity was undeterred. "And what about the window panes?" "They were all gone. One window had lost its entire frame, and in the other there was not a trace of glass in the little diamond apertures. They were that kind, the old lattice windows that went out of use before 1700. I don't believe they've had any glass for 100 years or more. Maybe the boy broke them if he got that far. The legend doesn't say." Manton was reflecting again. "I'd like to see that house, Carter. Where is it? Glass or no glass, I must explore it a little. And the tomb, where you put those bones, and the other grave, without an inscription. The whole thing must be a bit terrible." "You did see it, until it got dark." My friend was more wrought upon than I had suspected, for at this touch of harmless theatricalism, he started neurotically away from me and actually cried out with a sort of gulping gasp, which released a strain of previous repression. It was an odd cry, and all the more terrible because it was answered, for, as it was still echoing, I heard a creaking sound through the pitchy blackness, and knew that a lattice window was opening in that accursed old house beside us. And because all the other frames were long since fallen, I knew that it was the grisly, glassless frame of that demonic attic window. Then came a noxious rush of noisome, frigid air from that same dreaded direction, followed by a piercing shriek just beside me, on that shocking, rifted tomb of man and monster. In another instant, I was knocked from my gruesome bench by the devilish threshing of some unseen entity of titanic size but undetermined nature, knocked sprawling on the root-clutched mold of that abhorrent graveyard, while from the tomb came such a stifled uproar of gasping and whirring that my fancy peopled the rayless gloom with Miltonic legions of the misshapen damned. There was a vortex of withering, ice-cold wind, and then the rattle of loose bricks and plaster, but I had mercifully fainted before I could learn what it meant. Manton, though smaller than I, is more resilient, for we opened our eyes at almost the same instant despite his greater injuries. Our couches were side by side, and we knew in a few seconds that we were in St. Mary's Hospital. Attendants were grouped about in tense curiosity, eager to aid our memory by telling us how we came there, and we soon heard of the farmer who had found us at noon in a lonely field beyond Meadow Hill, a mile from the old burying ground, on a spot where an ancient slaughterhouse is reputed to have stood. Manton had 2 malignant wounds in his chest, and some less severe cuts or gougings in the back. I was not so seriously hurt, but was covered with welts and contusions of the most bewildering character, including the print of a split hoof. It was plain that Manton knew more than I, but he told nothing to the puzzled and interested physicians till he had learned what our injuries were. Then he said we were the victims of a vicious bull, though the animal was a difficult thing to place and account for. After the doctors and nurses had left, I whispered an awestruck question. Good God, Manton, but what was it? Those scars, was it like that? And I was too dazed to exult when he whispered back a thing I had half expected. No, it wasn't that way at all. It was everywhere. A gelatin, a slime. Yet it had shapes, 1,000 shapes of horror beyond all memory. There were eyes and a blemish. It was the pit, the maelstrom, the ultimate abomination. Carter, it was the Unnamable. Now we're going to take a break so that we can hear a word from our sponsor, and we will be back momentarily in order to discuss the Unnamable.
This podcast is brought to you by Tor Books. Read The Living Dead by George A. Romero and Daniel Kraus, on sale now wherever books are sold. When George Romero passed away in 2017, New York Times bestselling author Daniel Kraus finished the father of zombie horror's final zombie work. Set in the present day, The Living Dead is an entirely new tale, the story of the zombie plague as George A. Romero wanted to tell it. Joe Hill calls The Living Dead a horror landmark and a work of gory genius.
Okay, so The Unnamable was written in 1923. It was first published in July 1925 in an issue of Weird Tales, and it was first collected in Beyond the Wall of Sleep. The story's locale was inspired by the Charter Street Historic District burying ground in Salem, Massachusetts. And as we know, Lovecraft found a lot of inspiration in that general area. Now, some of the things I find interesting about this story, and some of the again, not overtly obvious cosmic horror aspects, but that are actually still present in the story, is this sort of discussion of the supernatural. Now, Lovecraft, in an essay aptly titled The Supernatural, he mentions that the oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear, and that the greatest fear is fear of the unknown. And we have something of that here. Basically, Carter, who is, again, I think, an autobiographical stand-in for Lovecraft himself, is discussing the possibility of the supernatural, which is interesting because Lovecraft's own worldview was very atheistic and very rooted in fact and science, and not given to belief in the supernatural. Now, I have heard in discussions of this story that this may not be the same Randolph Carter as in the first story, because given his experiences, he wouldn't be as resistant to the idea of the supernatural as he says he is in the story. But I don't get from the text itself that he's saying that he's resistant to the supernatural at all. It sounds to me that he is saying that he is more inclined to believe in certain aspects of the supernatural than aspects of the religious supernatural, which, ironically, in many religions, works the opposite way, that there's a belief in angels and demons and creatures from beyond, but say not in ghosts, or not in the possibility of other entities that have the same cosmic makeup, I guess, as the entities that religions take for granted. That there's no gray area, that there's no greater idea of in that worldview for anything beyond specifically what the Bible mentions. But the interesting thing, I think, is that Randolph Carter takes almost an opposite view, although I think really what they're arguing is sort of the same thing. Manton is arguing that anything that exists, anything that can be translated into the human experience in any way, has to have some explanation, some scientific explanation, which is, I think, closer to Lovecraft's own worldview, and that such things, certain supernatural things outside of, biblical teachings just can't be, or that they certainly couldn't be something you couldn't describe, because our whole purpose, our whole processing and perspective of our existence is through the five senses. So here we have, I think, one of the first implications of a cosmic horror perspective, that there are things beyond our knowing and beyond our comprehension, that there are things where the limited senses and the limited tools that we have for expressing our experiences, where they fail us, where that there are things that can go beyond those limited human modes of expression and understanding. And that is, I think, a very cosmic horror concept, which is discussed almost academically here at first. We have the idea, because Lovecraft often, there's almost a tongue-in-cheek parallelism here that Carter writes his stories the same way that Lovecraft does, that by the end of the story, the exposure to this cosmic horror, this great evil that human beings shouldn't even know exists, renders us almost unable to describe it or process it in any way. And I would imagine that readers of the fantastic, readers of weird fiction, and one of the escapes of one of the pleasures of such things is to be immersed in a world where the fantastic happens. And part of that immersion is a visual component. But what Lovecraft is saying here is that there are things that sometimes do defy description simply because we don't have the words. And I'm reminded, I think, of certain biblical studies where there is this sort of theory, perhaps sort of a conspiracy theory, that in biblical times, much of what was attributed to gods and to spirits and to angels and things like that actually did have a more scientific explanation, but were seen through the lens of and the limited vocabulary and tools of what the people were aware existed at the time. People in biblical times might not have been able to express what a nuclear weapon was like, or what a spaceship was like, or what an interdimensional rift was like. And so a lot of it came across as being angels, or the heavens opening up, or God sending messengers, sending his own messengers down to talk to human beings as a representative of his power and of his messages. There's a little bit, I think, of that happening here. That idea that what is unnameable for us is that even in modern times, and this is written in the 1920s, but even so, even in modern times, that there are things which we don't have the vocabulary for. And again, I think a lot of the fascination with UFOs could be described that way. This idea that that is the level of our ability to express what we're witnessing. That is where we've arrived. We apply science and technology now to the unexplainable, to the unnameable, in order to try to understand it. So we're basically mantoning our way through these paranormal experiences. We have, again, I think, the sense that Randolph Carter seems to manage to survive yet another brush with the occult by passing out. He faints. And so what he does remember, he perceives in a certain way, but even that is not nearly as much as his friend was apparently exposed to, because we get the impression that whatever this unnamable being is, it attacked Joe Manton first. And that Joe Manton maybe got more of an eyeful or a faceful of whatever this creature is. And I think that in order to process a lot of things, I think Randolph Carter in order to protect himself, he passes out. He takes the same approach that his characters in his stories do, in that the horror of something causes him to lose his senses, almost like the fainting sheep, But Joe Manton experienced it and does eventually concede that there are experiences which are unnameable, that there are beings and creatures which are unnameable. And the other thing I wanted to bring up is, because we don't often see this, I think, in Lovecraft's work as much as we have seen it in cosmic horror that predates Lovecraft. But we have a sense of the natural as paranormal or supernatural in the... And we also have a sense of urban legend. And I think that... Again, it sort of speaks to Lovecraft's view of how we process as a species, how we process the supernatural, and that it's relegated to urban legend. That there are, just as it would be difficult to describe what this creature looks like, it would be difficult to describe where this creature comes from. And what it is managed, how it manages to form. We have at least 2 versions of potential deaths for this creature. We have a couple of versions of its origins, that it was either born or somehow conjured, or, even when you're looking at sources that are supposed to be, historical sources for this being, there's conflicting stories. And that these conflicting stories suggest that it could be somewhat human, not at all human, partially human, influenced by humans, cared for by humans, that it attacks humans. There's a lot of contradiction, and we see that in urban legends. We see that, again, through the lenses of how we are best able to process the paranormal. And what it comes back to, I think, in a cosmic horror sense, what all of this says in a cosmic horror sense, is that there are entities, perhaps a network of entities, or a pantheon of entities, or a mythos of entities, which we can't explain. There are, if you want to take cryptids as a kind of lesser god, and then, maybe aliens as a greater god. That's kind of how we look at things today, but it's really no different than believing in, the Hounds of Tindalos, or the Unnamable, or, the fish creatures in Shadow over Innismouth, as opposed to Cthulhu and Nyarlathotep and Lovecraft's whole pantheon of gods. That there are ways that we process things, but really what it means is that we're still only seeing a little picture. Much like in the story we talked about last week, we are still only seeing a small picture of a greater thing, that the implication that the greater thing exists is enough to be terrifying, that the revelation of the nature of the greater thing would destroy us, because it would not only just dwarf the significance of human experience and individualism, but that it would actually destroy us to even know that insignificance, to even be able to put into perspective that kind of horror of knowing the bigger picture. And so there's, I think, prevalent through and pervasive through all of the Randolph Carter stories, I think, is this idea that it's much like what he said, much like what Lovecraft says in Call of Cthulhu, that maybe the saving grace is our inability to correlate all of these events at once, that so long as we only know a small part of the greater cosmic horror story, then we're okay. And that we can continue on sort of blithely and ignorantly believing that we are the center of the planet, at least, if not the center of the universe, and that what it comes down to is that that's just not true. And so nothing you do, nothing you say or experience really has any cosmic weight in comparison to the greater scheme of things. And I think, again, what I like about the idea of modern cosmic horror is that it tries to, whether it can successfully accomplish it or not, it tries to mitigate that awfully heavy and nihilistic and defeatist sort of worldview that in the face of the universe that we've been put into, our experiences mean nothing. I think a lot of modern cosmic horror reframes that, but there is something sort of profoundly heavy and horrific about, Lovecraft just sort of, dropping the mic there and saying, no, nothing that you do matters, because this is what's out there beyond. And this is what happens to human beings if you keep pushing for something greater, for something godlike, for something more than humanity. So that's it for this week. I hope you enjoyed our 2-part Randolph Carter, our 2-part Randolph Carter retrospective, I suppose. If you enjoy Cosmic Shenanigans, you can hear past issues through the Brian Keene Radio Network. You go to briankeene.com, click on the podcast/radio page, and it will take you to not just past episodes of Cosmic Shenanigans, but also the other podcast that I co-host, The Horror Show with Brian Keene, as well as several other great podcasts that are on the network. Once again, thank you to Tor for sponsoring our show these past 2 weeks, and I will bring you some more Cosmic Horror next week. Goodbye.
This podcast is brought to you by Tor Books. Read The Living Dead by George A. Romero and Daniel Kraus, on sale now wherever books are sold. When George Romero passed away in 2017, New York Times bestselling author Daniel Kraus finished the father of zombie horror's final zombie work. Set in the present day, The Living Dead is an entirely new tale, the story of the zombie plague as George A. Romero wanted to tell it. Joe Hill calls The Living Dead a horror landmark and a work of gory genius.
Cosmic Shenanigans is a production of the Brian Keene Radio Network. You can listen to this episode and all previous episodes for free on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, YouTube, Google Play Music, and wherever else podcasts are available. Cosmic Shenanigans is written and produced by Mary SanGiovanni. Our theme music is by Xander Harris. Our engineer is Matt Wilderson. Check out his books on Amazon.com. If you enjoyed this show, you might enjoy our other podcasts, The Horror Show with Brian Keene, Defenders Dialogue, and Grindcast. To advertise on Cosmic Shenanigans, visit briankeene.com and click Podcasts.